Hiya there, virtual rafters. How are you doing? Thanks for clicking and welcome. I'm just out here in the middle of the ocean and doing some building again. This project's super random. I'm seeing if I can make this semi-truck looking thing for no real reason other than that I just couldn't think of anything better. The creative idea generator has been in idle, but this was still fun to put together. While assembling it, I was listening to this old radio broadcast from WFMT Chicago that aired all the way back in 1962. The subject of the interview is Erik Hesselberg, who was one of the daring rafters who sailed from Peru to the islands of French Polynesia. 4,300 miles over 101 days without even a way to steer the raft, and all for the sake of settling an argument about migration patterns. The equipment they chose to go with wasn't much different than what's allotted in the opening of Raft gameplay, which makes it rather a fascinating journey to look into, realizing that the game's situation wouldn't actually be impossible to survive, but that it would also have important lessons to learn along the way about modern life. So I thought I would share this with you, since it's also going to take a little while to put this build together.
And it was Olaf Tryggvason, sailing over the North Sea wide, bearing the hope to found a kingdom far on the other side. It was Olaf Tryggvason founding it near a spot to land. And it was Olaf Tryggvason who saw, as he sighted land, towering temples, domes, and spires glistening in virgin white. This perhaps seems the ideal way to introduce our guest this morning, Erik Hesselberg, who was the navigator of the celebrated raft Kon-Tiki. Mr. Hesselberg, this song has a familiar ring to you, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, it's very well known. It's about Olaf Tryggvason, the Viking king. What I know about him is not too much, I must say. He was jumping backwards and marching on the oars outside his ships.
What were you doing?
Strange, isn't it?
On Kon-Tiki?
I was just finding out where we were in the Pacific. Finding the position by means of sextant and all these things.
You were the navigator of
Yes.
the raft itself. Perhaps the story is worth this, one of the most dramatic voyages of our time, may be worth recreating by one of the participants, you, sir. Thor Heyerdahl was the skipper.
He was the man with the ID, yes. And he got the ID in 1938, as a matter of fact. On the Marquesas Island, he was there on his honeymoon and was wondering about all the stones he found there, figures of gods, and asking the inhabitants there where they came from and so on. And so he got interested in their origin, and that has been a problem all the time, where the Polynesian race came from.
And his theory, Thor Heyerdahl's theory, is that it may have come from South America.
He started simply to study it here in America, different places, and then he had a theory at last, which he wrote down in a scientific work. And according to this theory, they must have come from the sun, from the east, where the sun rises, and from Peru, and could have been the old pre-Incaic population of Peru. And they could have come over, according to his theory, by means of balsa rafts. That was in short, his theory, but nobody believed in him. And so he had to prove it, build such a raft himself, or we were a couple of 6 men building it, just like the Indians did, and we had also fine drawings from the time of Pizarro, who were in Peru, you know, in 1530. And he had some designers with him. Do you say designers?
Designers.
Yeah, designers, yeah. And they, there exist lots of examples of rafts drawn by these people from Pizarro in American Museum, and we just copied this design.
And so then Heyerdahl and you and your colleagues used Peruvian balsa wood.
Yes, we got the balsa from Ecuador, brought it down to Callao, outside the Peruvian coast, and started there after 3 months, having built the raft.
We're living in the 20th century, but here was an attempt by an anthropologist and by you, his colleague, and we'll ask about your interests in a moment. You yourself were an experienced seaman.
Yes, I was, yeah. I still am, I hope.
You were the navigator.
I was the navigator, yes. My job was to find the position every day by means of stars and sun, and so it went very fine. But I couldn't influence the raft, couldn't control it, couldn't pick up where to go or something, like a boat, you see.
You didn't have any modern equipment to do this?
We had not the modern equipment, I wouldn't say that, just the ordinary old instruments to find a position in an astronomical way and terrestrial way. We hadn't any radar or all these things they have now.
Because the purpose was to recreate the voyage that might have been taken centuries ago.
Yes, exactly. But it was also important to know where we were, because we had different other things to do also, beside the main purpose to get over it. We took some observations, some hydrological observations and zoological observations and such things. And then we just drifted along, having a nice time, I must say.
A nice time?
Oh, yes.
No hardships?
To me, it was very, very fine.
Well, why do you say this? It was a challenge to you, was that it? It was a challenge of you versus the elements.
No, that's not right.
Oh,
no, just the existence on the raft. Can you imagine that? Just sitting there in the warm sun during the day and all this brilliant sea. And you were naked, like an original human being, and a Homo sapiens, and with a little bit of muscles and a little brain, and having no troubles with addresses or property or telephone, nothing. Just sitting there. And you couldn't help it. You couldn't do anything. You could just exist, just have a look around, just see all the animals in the sea coming along, and they were not afraid. They had no experiences with human beings. To them, the whole raft and the strange frogs on it was something very curious, something like themselves. They were not afraid. There were no noises of motors or something. So they came up and they rugged themselves against the logs, so you could observe them, you could touch them. See? That's a fine feeling.
So you then were a free, unencumbered man, and so the animals of the sea saw you this way.
Yes. And so it went on for over 3 months until we at last saw land over in the Polynesian islands. Just a little coral reef we saw in the beginning. Puka Puka was the name. Puka Puka. And then after a while we stranded on the coral reef there too. That was a little bit dangerous, I must say. But we came ashore all right.
It was a 3-month trip. 3 months.
101 days, yeah.
How many miles was that?
That makes about 4,300 sea miles. It's about 1/5 of the rounding of our Earth.
Circumference of the Earth.
Conference, you say? I don't know that word.
But it was one 1/5 of the Earth's
1/5.
distance around.
There you are, yeah.
And in this raft, without modern equipment, outside of the devices for testing and discovery. But navigational equipment was not modern.
Oh, no.
Nothing.
No.
So
Nothing compared to today.
So you, as navigator, merely judged it. It was you and the elements. You and the
Yes, you were in the middle of the elements, and that wasn't a bad thing to be. Oh, no, you felt just fine, and you felt easy about it. You don't think in the same way somehow when you are in this situation. Can you imagine that?
Would you mind expanding on this a bit, talking about this a bit more, Mr. Hesselberg? So you don't think the same way when you're in this world, this environment, than we do today with all our technological advances?
Yes. Nowadays, or in the ordinary life, in the so-called civilized world, and you must depend on so many things around you which you can't control. They control you somehow. And it is like it on the open ocean. You don't see any land, any ships. You have no connections anymore. You are somehow away from this world. And so nobody else controls you than the elements, and you can't do anything with them. See, I think this is a good feeling.
The feeling that you were in charge.
You can't criticize them.
You, the man, were in charge of
Yes,
yourself.
You are just a little brain sitting there. Also, having a little bit fun of yourself. Considering you from the outside and into your own little center. And to me, I think many people should have such an experience. Not while it sounds popular, but I really mean it. Should sit for a while on a raft outside and having this calmness. Even if you have a storm going on, then it is mixed up with some tension which is necessary in everybody's life. I think. You could have rafts. You could imagine big rafts having people on them. They could fish. It shouldn't be so well organized. Shouldn't be any show business going on the rafts. They shouldn't have any possibilities except on being themselves, and you are always clean there. You can't get any illnesses. Not that kind of illnesses you get in contact with all the other people.
So there's several discoveries you made, aside from the attempts of your skipper, Thor Heyerdahl, and yourself and colleagues, discovering how a certain art came to the Polynesians. You discovered things about yourself as human beings.
Oh, yes. I think that was the most important discovery. What we proved there was just that it was possible to get over. And in the meanwhile, we have had several rafts on the same area. It has been like a school, I would say. But that's possible to come over by means of such a primitive raft, that's sure. So it could be like that. And Thor Heyerdahl himself, he has written lots of books about it, and he is a great specialist, no doubt about that, on this question.
Yes, of man discovering himself
and the origin of the Polynesian race have something to do anyhow with the old people from the Titicaca Sea up in the
if we may just
up in the Andes.
We may just perhaps strike another avenue of talk now. We can return to you in this key point of man's discovery of himself as a free person with the elements, free from the technology that seems to control him, as your inference. The theory of Mr. Heyerdahl, this had not been held before, had it? What was the theory before the trip about Polynesian culture?
the theory before was, or they believed always that they came from Asia. Also, that will say that they had to go then against currents, against winds. And his simple idea in itself is that human beings, they are like leaves for the wind. They are gone with the wind, gone with the big forces in nature. And that brings you also on the idea that you could probably also explain, for instance, cultures in Central America in this way. I mean, it is... I'm not the man to talk exactly and to mean something at all, but I could imagine that the Indians coming down, being a Siberic folk and nomads, hunters and fishers, they must have received an impulsion from somebody to build up in an exotic land like Yucatan and Central America, such cultures that they have down there. So maybe somebody came along with a raft or some kind of primitive craft, just learning them how to build up agriculture, to build up pyramids and start to think on astronomy and all these things.
And does Mr. Hardall and you, do you feel that his theory was proved? The theory that it was South American in origin?
Yes, he feels that, yeah.
Now you spent, before I ask you that, you mentioned the raft. I'm taking with you, how many were there of you on this raft?
We were 6 on the raft.
There were 6 on this raft, a more than 4,000-mile trip without any of the modern appurtenances. You spoke of yourself having a good time. That is you. And your, what is... Can you recreate in your mind now some of the thoughts, the nature of your thinking as you sat on this? You were busy working, of taking findings, of course, but...
I've always been asked if we were afraid and so being scared of everything. But I must say, honestly, I wasn't so scared. 2, 3 times, yes. But we didn't think on that, I think. It was just going on and going on, going on. You couldn't do anything else just to keep yourself on the raft. And then it was somehow like nature herself. And then, to me, this was really good.
When there were lulls in the work, there may have been now and then easy times when you weren't exactly working. Your conversation then, you and your colleagues covered every subject in the world.
6 very, very different characters. We had different opinions. And it was always some discussions going on. And I remember one thing which is interesting, I think, to everybody, and that was on this little space, you see, 6 different characters sitting there, exactly knowing that we are on this little space now, and we shouldn't search for trouble. That would mean probably a catastrophe to everybody. So I think this is the same as our globe. Can you imagine?
Yes, this is...
Globe being a raft in the universe, and we all sitting on this raft. And we shouldn't make so much trouble.
It's a very...
Because it would be a catastrophe one day when we let all the fanatics talk all the time.
It's a very dramatic way of...
Yeah, but you couldn't...
a microcosm of the world. You 6 men, in a sense, were humanity on this raft.
You have the Pacific, this enormous ocean.
And who was man? Just 6 of you? Just 6?
You have the little raft drifting
men
along
on a raft.
Like our globe drifting along in the universe.
And because of the situation, there had to be a modus vivendi. I mean, there had to be this living together.
You had to be conscious about this. I mean, as a certain logic, as a certain necessity. Don't you agree?
Of course. This is a marvelous way of. It's a marvelous way of putting it. Of The moral is pretty obvious, it seems,
Yeah.
to us living in 1962 with possibilities of mushroom clouds overhead.
Now we are in the same situation as such a raft. If you don't think on this, then, and if everybody is occupied about his brave ideas or his way of living, being the right one, and all the fanatism or even just small things, then the main thing is that we are here and we have to stay together and we can't search for trouble all the time.
This was one more of the discoveries then you made on this journey.
Right, you are.
You say each of the 6 was different. And what I'm sure you, by this time, you've known your other 5
Oh,
colleagues.
yes, I know them very, very well. They are like brothers.
In what way was each of you different?
There were one there, he was very religious, for instance. Another one, he wasn't religious at all. He was absolutely free. He was a free thinker, they say in Norway. And then you had a man with, I wouldn't say communistic tendency, but a very near to
Socialistic.
a socialistic tendency. And then you had the brave intellect, just being intellect, nothing else.
The cold intellect.
I wouldn't say cold intellect, but anyhow, very much of intellect. And then you had the type, never mind, everything goes fine, and to me it's just the same, and so.
That was you.
Oh, no.
No, that wasn't you.
No.
I won't try to guess. Go
You,
ahead.
yes, you would ask me now.
Which you was. I won't. I won't.
That's getting interesting.
Go ahead. This is
Well,
marvelous.
then you had different types. Let's say that those 6 of these 6 men, they represented somehow different opinions, different way of living, and so on. What I was doesn't really matter. I was the man making music, by the way.
In what way?
Playing guitar all the time. Singing.
You were?
Yeah. Doesn't mean so much either, but that was very fine.
You had the guitar. What were you playing?
yeah.
What were you singing?
I used to sing folk songs,
Norwegian folk songs?
all kinds of folk
Yeah.
songs. American songs too. Do
Is
you
that-
know that fine folk song from, I think it is from Mississippi, about the train called Shorty George?
Do you know that one?
Sure.
Could you do part of that? Do you remember that now?
Yeah, well, there's Shorty George. He ain't no friend of mine, and so on.
Yeah.
Such songs.
Mississippi
Many others.
Chain Gang song. That was a prison
Yeah,
song.
all kinds of songs.
So you kept them
Yeah,
amused
longing
then?
for the women and the children coming along with that train. It's a sad story, by the way. But I used to sing Bellman. Have you heard about Bellman?
Bellman, the
Oh, Bellman
so-
is
the Robert
most
Burns of,
genius man you
Sweden.
can imagine. Yeah.
the poet,
Great,
composer.
great man. And so when you had this music, you had also some calmness around. This is a fine idea. When somebody making music, the others are quiet. They don't talk anymore. Very useful.
This
In our world also.
this is a remarkable. It's almost a parable if it weren't true. This is a true parable, a parable
It
that
is.
happened. Yes,
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
and yet it's a
So
parable.
in this way, this raft is much more
Yes.
useful than
Yes.
just to serve a theory.
Yes,
Don't you think so?
and how?
I think it is the most important thing is just this. 6 different characters on this little space. Being equal to our situation today. With all these atomic bombs and this terrible fear of wars and destroying. Nobody would like to lose their lives. Why should they? No. Everybody fearing the big mushroom coming up one day. No, that's terrible. That is the catastrophe.
Within this, what was the size? This is again is connected with this whole story. What was the size of this raft in which there were 6 men for 30? How many months was this now? This was 3 months? No.
101 days.
100
It makes a little bit more than a quarter of a year.
6 men, and what was the size of the raft?
Size was about 30 feet long, about 15 feet broad, or wide, as you say.
6 men, each holding different opinions, and a raft 30 by 15 feet for 103 days.
And we couldn't walk all over that raft, you see.
No place to
go. Just a place to walk around the hut. We had a little hut there of banana leaves and some primitive things, as the Indians had. Exactly the same. So we used to sleep, but we couldn't stay inside. We just were there like sardines somehow. And outside we could sit and talk. And just before the hut it was a little bit of space. You couldn't walk on the logs because they were so glippery. They were green with seaweed. After a while the whole raft was like an island. And you had to be careful. Many sharks around all the time. Remember one morning we had 11 sharks. You could touch them, they were just around.
They were man-eating sharks.
I don't know.
You didn't test.
They were probably absolutely innocent. They didn't attack us at all. They were just curious, and they are very nice to look at. I must say they have a wonderful shape. Yes.
So the sharks, whom we consider the enemy,
you see all this stuff about sharks, and
you found friendly.
it is somehow exaggerated. And to me, they are just fine animals. I wouldn't like to put my leg into the mouth of the shark. Maybe the shark wouldn't like it either.
Your 5 colleagues, obviously this trip has changed. Obviously it's changed you, enriched you in many ways, Mr. Hesselberg.
Know, maybe I was like that all the time.
Perhaps
Everybody
you were.
Is like
Perhaps you were, but you were able to find certain truths about yourself. Were they too affected as you were? Do you feel all 5 were affected
in
as you were?
some way or another, but I never asked them right away about that. I never did. Would be interesting to know. Strangely enough, we never discussed this.
You never discussed this. That was so close to your lives.
Maybe it is a subjective experience hidden into yourself somehow. I just know that one of the men, Torsten, he is a so-called hero from the war. He was the man behind Tirpitz. He was the man who helped the Allies to sink Tirpitz, this big battleship. Heard about that story, I suppose. His most wonderful experience was on that raft. That's easy to say because nothing similar happened. But it was more dangerous. In itself, it was more dangerous than this Tirpitz affair and so on. But I think in his case, it was about the same as my case, that he found this life just logic somehow and fine, in the point of view of being amongst elements and not amongst technical things. We had no motors, of course. We had a little radio, but we couldn't use it all the time. It was too small, and the batteries, they were dry batteries, they went wet, so we hadn't any connection, just short messages. And at last we couldn't use them at all.
And in navigating, it was you and the stars and...
Stars and the sun.
And the sun.
Yeah. Sometimes we couldn't have any positions either because we had no stars and no sun for weeks.
Then how did you navigate?
Then we just drifted along It didn't any matter because we couldn't change anything. It's fine to know where you are, fine to know exactly where you are, but it isn't so necessary either.
You weren't going to fight and destroy yourself, you know, and eat yourself out, as we'd say, in not knowing where you are at the moment.
Yeah. Do we know where we are all the time? No.
Mr. Hesselberg, this adventure of yours obviously is one that few men have had, and yet perhaps we vicariously can learn, I hope we can, from your adventure. You remained on the Polynesians for a while, didn't you? You did.
Together with the others, yes, amongst the Polynesians on the Raroia atoll. It was just 127 of them, and they didn't have much connection to our world. And afterwards we got over to Tahiti, which is much more civilized, and it's like a center down there, with the big lines coming from the Panama Canal over to Australia. They are passing Tahiti.
Which way of life attracted you more, the atoll or Tahiti?
The atoll, absolutely. At Papeete you have all kinds of stuff, as we have, cinemas and cars, and women are painted, and all this, as we know here in Chicago, everywhere. This is not exactly the same. I don't want to destroy that tourism, of course not.
That's okay.
You find that in Norway too,
but everywhere, but on the atoll.
Concentration.
But there you found a freedom similar to what you had on the raft, to some extent.
To some extent, yes, but not exactly the same, because, and we shouldn't forget to mention that we sat there voluntarily. But we are here on our globe also voluntarily. You can't help it being here. Mm-hmm. But when you are here voluntarily. You search your place somewhere, don't you?
I'm going to ask you.
You are sitting here in the studio now.
See, we're talking now. We are using a modern machine right now.
Yes,
we're talking to a microphone,
yeah.
And this is good. And a good number of people hear what you have to say. So the question I'm asking you now, Mr. Hesselberg, is you yourself, I'm asking this now, you're not opposed to the machine as such.
No.
But to the way which has been used, I take it.
Machine is a tool, and you should never forget that. You should never dominate anything. The most important is the human beings themselves, with their wonderful machinery, brain, heart, all this. Heart pumping all the time. You don't think on it. 7 beats in a minute. That's 70, excuse me. That's strange, isn't it? And all this brain, and I think that's fantastic.
The human machine.
Much more fantastic than all these electronics or the man wanting to go to the moon. He can't escape from himself anyhow. I don't want to go to the moon.
And yet, I want to ask...
Maybe you would like to go there, I don't know. Maybe everybody would like to go to the moon.
I'm not overly curious at the moment. I mean, since the Earth itself, as you say, so much remains to be discovered here about ourselves.
So, yeah.
But at the same time, the question I'm asking you is the machine itself, that is the non-human machine, the machine that is not man. You're not opposed to this if man dominates it. Right? As I take it, you're opposed to the machine. We are serving the machine.
Well, if we are serving the machine, if I understand you right now, that will say that the machine dominates us because it's always marching and marching, must be feeded. Then it's something wrong, I think. Something terrible. Then you are worse than nothing. Machine is something very important then. The machine doesn't think, doesn't feel, haven't any sentiments, haven't any children, can't produce any children. It's just dead material. I am if you have a brand new Cadillac or something, and you have a little flower, just a wild little flower, what thing would you admire then? To me, it isn't a question at all, the little flower, because you can't even produce that flower in all the laboratories of America. With all the billions and billions of dollars, you can produce a little flower. But this Cadillac you can produce every day. This is cheap to say, maybe, but it is something in it. Something enormous. Yeah.
And there's an automobile commercial goes on, and the men watch this automobile. They speak of it with love as though they were speaking of a woman. It's very definitely. Oh, yes, they're watching it sexually, do you see. They speak of it as though it were a woman or a lovely child, and this is what you're talking about, obviously.
Yes.
Yes.
Somehow it is. You're right.
Well, what do you think what do you have? Not all can live your life, the life you've been living, Mr. Hesselberg, on the raft. Yet as the world becomes more and more technologically advanced, what is do you have an idea the way man can live? Yet he's living, the machine is here. Obviously, we cannot destroy the machines that have been invented.
No, it should be a tool, and the machine is all right. It is brilliant brain work to construct a machine. Certainly it is. And if we could imagine lots of machines everywhere serving the human beings, at last they needn't to work, probably, then I think that would be dangerous too, because you would get on being more and more decadent, like the old Romans. And that doesn't seem to be right. Somehow it's...
The question is, who owns what, or does what own who? I mean...
Very right. And I don't mean to say that it is so easygoing either, but to me it would be fine that different people could meet each other, and having the possibility to talk to each other. Russians and Americans, the two enfants terribles, just now. They should come and talk. They should sit on the raft. Could have Kennedy and Khrushchev sitting on the raft, just talking.
Why not?
They wouldn't do each other anything. They would even have the situation they had to be together on the same level all the time.
Just as something happened to the perspective of six men on Kon-Tiki, something might happen to the perspective of a couple of other men.
Yeah.
Erik Hesselberg, this has been a very rewarding time for me. There's a great deal you have to say. Just in what you've said now, I think there are so many implications that are clear, certainly, to the audience, to listeners, to everybody. Anything else you'd care to say that we haven't talked about?
There are many things we haven't talked about.
I know.
Well, in this case, I think the main thing is already said. That's very simple. But we can talk about Chicago, if you like. Where is the monument of the famous cow? Children in my country, they know about the cow. And why don't you make a legend, a real legend out of that cow? Kicking the lamp, running away, being astonished about all this heat and flames and all, finding a green field, going on cowing, chewing new grass. To me, this is a very...
You know, Erik Hesselberg, you're talking about a point now that is very touchy to a great many people in Chicago. The point, not so much the cow, but the idea of landmarks, monuments, traditions being ignored, in fact being torn down here too, you see. In the name of progress, many things are happening, like high rises and something we call, and as a result of which there are certain traditions that go. Somehow, you obviously value tradition because of the effect it has on us today, but unfortunately, others don't quite see it that way. So that's why there's no cow, for example, memorialized, among others, among humans who are part of the city's tradition.
Oh, that's maybe a ridiculous thing, but
no, it isn't ridiculous at all. It touches another point. Erik Hesselberg, it's unnecessary for me to say that your life was a full one and a rich one, and maybe it's stretching point in saying many people envy your life, yet they probably need a great deal of courage and, more than that, freedom from whatever pressures or possessions they may have to lead this life. You're one of the rare men, I'd say, in our time who can lead this life and understand what a human being is, what man can be and should be. Thank you very much.
This rather ancient recording might give some new perspective the next time you're just hanging around your raft in game about how realistically you could navigate to where you were trying to get. This is a bit of an odd raft truck-like build compared to what Hesselberg talks about. Mere balsa wood. If you've ever had an experience with the stuff, then you know how flimsy it can be. It's amazing to think that it worked. But even as recently as a few weeks ago, there was a story of a survivor who made it 49 days on a simple raft before being pulled to safety by a passing cargo ship. He survived on fish he caught and the ingenuity of rigging his own water purification. It would undoubtedly be an uncomfortable 49 days, but this 19-year-old proved that it could be survived when his raft's rope broke away from its mooring while the young'un was working from fishing spots. The link is down below in the description for the full interview, but I included almost all of it because I think it's quite remarkable. There's much to think about in here. The thing in the interview that caught my attention was Hesselberg's mentality about being at peace with the elements, that compared to the modern world's illusion of control, the seas didn't offer him so much of a choice in how to live, but that he loved the experience, recommending that it's one that any person should undertake. Perhaps he found some secrets to life out there on the waves. I would imagine humans would learn something about the philosophical fight over free will and determinism, because when you're on a rudderless balsa raft, you really don't have much control over what happens to you, do you? Free will might seem like a little bit of a joke during a storm. What will you, shout to the heavens and tell the waves to stop? Modern life delusion has fooled so many into believing that they have control that they do not. Perhaps a month or two on a balsa raft would drive that point home. Hesselberg thinks that the most important discovery was to prove that it was possible to survive, because it would mean something for understanding the way humans developed or traversed the planet. You can tell Heyerdahl didn't believe in free will, as he thought that humans were like leaves, they go with the wind. The whole basis behind this theory to prove that South Americans rafted thousands of miles to create new cultures, collaborating with others, because to believe the current theory was to insist that European or Asian settlers sailed against the current, something that we only today do with the use of engine power, steam, gas, or otherwise. It's often our modern advancements that cause us to forget how powerless we really are. Perhaps your time in Raft will help you find that illusion of control without actually having to do the 4,300 miles yourself. If there's 6 of you sitting on a raft, you probably shouldn't go looking for a catastrophe, and that is comparable to modern life. You had to be conscious about it in every moment on that raft, or it could mean death as a consequence. He warns people about their brave ideas and their way of doing things. Those are catastrophes of which he speaks. All too relevant advice to this day. Best not to go looking for trouble. Yeah, it's quite interesting listening to him talk about the reactions and behaviors of the 6 men, how they all respond differently to the same situation. It goes to show that certainly there isn't a singular reaction to this kind of stress. Only some will freak out about not being able to control every aspect of their life, but such a long trip would perhaps beat that right out of them anyway. But what's also amusing is the interviewer seems a little bit typical arrogance, making so many assumptions about the mindsets or reactions of others, mostly projecting his own ideas as if everyone is the same as him. It shows the interviewer thinks that they know people really well, that they should just assume their feelings, but yet Hesselberg has to correct him several times. I wonder if the interviewer realizes how rude and biased they were while trying to look clever. Perhaps he should listen and learn from the guests that he's invited on his program, that his modern way of thinking with his biases are a danger in itself. The interviewer almost wants to argue that his modern way of life is better and that he doesn't want to accept that someone else can have a different perspective. It may be hard for the interviewer to accept that not everyone believes the modern life he lives is superior, but that's exactly part of the point, proving that superiority of European westernized technology doesn't explain all human travel in earlier centuries either. So I'm going to revisit this radio broadcast interview again in a future video about the storyline, as I suspect some of the inspiration behind the game could have originated out of this man's story, or Weiss or Heyerdahl became curious about the cultures of French Polynesia and their origins, which has huge implications for the evolutions of cultures. But I'm back to farming up some trash, and if you're looking for more raft videos, there's a playlist of guides and walkthroughs on my channel. There'll be more random creative builds coming soon, so take care y'all, and bye-bye!